The dust from the departing train still hung in the air when Clara understood the full weight of her mistake. She stood on the platform of Belridge Station, if you could call 4 planks of weathered wood and a crooked sign a station, with her single trunk at her feet and the taste of humiliation burning in her throat. Around her, the Colorado Territory stretched out in every direction, brown, endless, and utterly indifferent to the fact that her entire life had just collapsed. "Miss Whitmore?" She'd turned at the sound of her name, hope flaring stupid and desperate in her chest. After 3 weeks on trains that smelled of coal smoke and unwashed bodies, after crossing rivers and mountains and plains that seemed to go on forever, she'd finally arrived. Thomas Garrett had sent for her. Thomas Garrett, with his neat handwriting and careful promises, had asked her to come west and marry him, to help him build something in this raw new country. The man who approached her wasn't smiling. He was tall, well-dressed in a way that seemed almost aggressive out here. Dark suit, polished shoes, a hat that had probably cost more than everything Clara owned. His face was long and pinched, like he'd been sucking on something sour for the better part of his life. "Mr. Garrett?" Clara smoothed her skirts, suddenly conscious of every patch, every mended seam. The dress had been her best once, back in Philadelphia. Now it just looked tired. "I'm Clara Whitmore. I got your letters." "Yes." He looked her up and down, his mouth tightening. "I can see that you did." Something cold slithered down Clara's spine. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. In his letters, Thomas had been warm, eloquent even. He'd written about loneliness and fresh starts, about how a good woman could make a life out here mean something. She'd read those letters so many times the paper had gone soft at the creases. "I've made arrangements at the boarding house," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "As you suggested. I thought perhaps tomorrow we could—" "There won't be a tomorrow, Miss Whitmore." Thomas Garrett's voice was flat, businesslike. "I'm afraid I've made a mistake." The world seemed to tilt. "I don't understand." "I was under the impression that you came from a family of some standing. Your letters suggested as much." His gaze flicked over her again, lingering on her worn boots, the frayed edge of her sleeve. "Clearly, I was mistaken. I have a position to maintain in this community, Miss Whitmore. I'm opening a bank next month. I need a wife who can help elevate my standing, not drag it down." Clara felt her face go hot, then cold. "I never claimed to be wealthy, Mr. Garrett. I was honest about—" "Were you?" He raised an eyebrow. "You failed to mention that you'd be arriving looking like a refugee from a poor house. Really, Miss Whitmore, I expected better judgment from you." The casual cruelty of it took her breath away. She'd spent the last of her savings on the train ticket west. She'd left behind everything, her job at the textile mill, her cramped room in a boarding house that smelled of boiled cabbage, the few people who might have cared if she lived or died. She'd done it because Thomas Garrett had written about building something together, about partnership and hope. She'd been such an idiot. "The next eastbound train leaves day after tomorrow," Thomas continued, checking his pocket watch as if this were just another business transaction. "I'll arrange for your ticket. Consider it compensation for your trouble. I used my last money getting here." Clara hated how small her voice sounded. "I can't stay at a boarding house for 2 days." "That's unfortunate." He didn't sound like he thought it was unfortunate at all. "Perhaps you should have considered that before making such a reckless journey." He turned to leave, and something snapped inside Clara. She'd been polite her whole life, quiet, careful not to make waves or ask for too much. And where had it gotten her? Standing in the middle of nowhere, about to be abandoned by a man who couldn't be bothered to even pretend to feel bad about it. "You're a coward," she said. Thomas stopped, turned back slowly. "Excuse me?" "You wrote me 6 letters." Clara's hands were shaking, but her voice was getting stronger. 6 letters about loneliness and fresh starts and building something meaningful. You asked me to uproot my entire life and come out here, and now you're throwing me away because my dress isn't fancy enough? You're a coward and a liar, Mr. Garrett. His face darkened. "You'd do well to watch your tongue, Miss Whitmore. You're in a precarious position." "I'm in a precarious position because you put me here." "I put you nowhere. You came of your own free will." He stepped closer, his voice dropping. "And if you think making a scene is going to change my mind, you're more foolish than I thought. I don't want you. Is that clear enough?" Go back east where you belong." He walked away then, his boots clicking against the wooden platform with crisp, final authority. Clara watched him climb into a black buggy and drive off without a backward glance, trailing dust and shattered promises. The platform was empty now. The sun was starting to sink toward the mountains in the west, painting the sky in shades of copper and rust. Clara stood there trying to figure out what the hell she was supposed to do next. She had $3.62. Her trunk held 2 more dresses, both in worse shape than the one she was wearing, some undergarments, a hairbrush, and a photograph of her parents, dead now 5 years. That was it. That was everything she had in the world. The boarding house would cost at least $1 a night. The train ticket east, even if Thomas kept his word about paying for it, wouldn't leave for 2 days. And then what? Back to Philadelphia? Back to 12-hour shifts at the mill, breathing lint until her lungs burned, living in a room the size of a closet with walls so thin she could hear every sound from the rooms on either side? She'd left because there was nothing there. Nothing but work and exhaustion and the slow grinding certainty that this was all life would ever be. Thomas's letters had offered something different. Not wealth, she'd never been naive enough to expect that, but purpose. A place. Someone who wanted her around. She'd been wrong about all of it. Clara picked up her trunk. It wasn't heavy, she didn't own enough for it to be heavy, and started walking. She didn't have a destination. The town of Belridge stretched out ahead of her, a single main street of false-fronted buildings that looked like they were barely holding on against the wind. There was a general store, a saloon, what looked like a church, and a few other structures she couldn't identify from this distance. Her feet hurt. Everything hurt. But stopping meant thinking, and thinking meant feeling the full weight of how completely she'd ruined her life. She'd made it maybe 50 yards when she heard the horse. The sound of hooves made her turn, and she saw a man riding toward her on a rangy bay gelding. He was different from Thomas Garrett in every possible way. Rough, where Thomas had been polished. Weathered, where Thomas had been smooth. He wore work clothes, denim and leather, and his face had the kind of tan that came from years under an unforgiving sun. He looked to be in his early 30s, maybe, with dark hair that needed cutting and eyes the color of creek water. He pulled up next to her, his horse blowing softly. "You need help with that trunk?" His voice was low, rough-edged. Clara's grip tightened on the handle. "I'm fine." "Didn't ask if you were fine. Asked if you needed help." He swung down from the saddle with an easy grace that came from spending most of his life on horseback. Up close, she could see the lines around his eyes, the scar cutting through his left eyebrow. "Saw what happened with Garrett." Heat flooded her face. Of course he had. Probably half the town had watched Thomas Garrett reject her on the platform like spoiled goods. "Then you know I'm not his problem anymore," Clara said tightly. "I'm nobody's problem." "Didn't say you were a problem." The man, she still didn't know his name, studied her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Not pity, exactly. Something else. "Said you looked like you could use help with that trunk." "Why?" The word came out sharper than she'd intended. "What's it to you?" "Nothing, I guess." He shrugged. "Except it's getting dark. You're clearly new to Belridge, and that trunk looks like it's about to bust your arms off. Seems like the kind of situation where offering help is just basic decency." Claire wanted to tell him to go away. She wanted to tell him she didn't need his charity or his pity or whatever this was. But her arms were tired, her feet were screaming, and the sun was sinking fast. "The boarding house," she heard herself say. "If you could just help me get there." "Boarding house is full up. Miners came through yesterday, took all the rooms." He picked up her trunk like it weighed nothing. "But there's a room above the general store. Mrs. Chen rents it out sometimes. I can take you there." Of course the boarding house was full. Of course it was. Clara followed him down the street, too exhausted to argue. The town looked even more desolate up close. Buildings that hadn't seen paint in years, boardwalks with missing planks, windows dark and empty. A few people were out, moving between the saloon and the general store, but they barely glanced at Clara. She was already old news, apparently. Just another Eastern fool who'd come west chasing dreams and found dust instead. The general store was a low building with a false front and windows displaying sacks of flour and coils of rope. The man carried her trunk inside, and Clara followed, struck immediately by the smell of coffee and leather. And something sharp, that might have been turpentine. A small Chinese woman appeared from behind the counter, wiping her hands on her apron. She looked at Clara, then at the man with the trunk, and something passed between them that Clara couldn't interpret. "Mrs. Chen, this is—" The man paused, looked at Clara. "I don't actually know your name." "Clara Whitmore." She was too tired to be embarrassed anymore. "I need a room, just for tonight, maybe tomorrow night. I can pay." Mrs. Chen's gaze was sharp, assessing. $2, up front. $2 would leave Clara with almost nothing, but she didn't have a choice. She dug the money out of her bag and handed it over. Mrs. Chen took it, nodded once, and disappeared into the back of the store. The man was still standing there, holding her trunk. "You can put it down," Clara said. "Thank you for your help." "Name's Caleb Rourke." He set the trunk down carefully. "I've got a ranch about 5 miles north of here. If you need work—" "I don't need work." The lie came automatically, defensive. "I'm leaving day after tomorrow." Caleb Rourke looked at her for a long moment, and Clara had the uncomfortable feeling that he could see right through her, see the fear, the desperation, the crushing weight of having absolutely no idea what came next. "All right," he said finally. "Good luck to you, Miss Whitmore." He left, the door swinging shut behind him, and Clara was alone in the dim interior of the general store. Mrs. Chen came back with a key. "Upstairs, last door on the right. No cooking, no visitors, no noise after 9. She handed Clara the key. "You need anything else? Store opens at 6. The room was small and plain, a narrow bed, a washstand, a single window that looked out over the street. But it was clean, and it was private, and for tonight at least, it was hers. Clara sank onto the bed and let herself feel it, the full crushing weight of her situation. She was alone in a town that didn't want her, with barely any money and no prospects. The train ticket Thomas had promised might not even materialize, and even if it did, going back east meant admitting complete defeat. She didn't cry. She'd learned a long time ago that crying didn't fix anything. Instead, she lay back on the thin mattress and stared at the ceiling, listening to the sounds of Belridge settling in for the night. Voices from the saloon, a dog barking somewhere in the distance, the wind picking up, rattling the window in its frame. Tomorrow, she'd figure out what to do. Tomorrow, she'd make a plan. Tonight, she just needed to survive. Morning came too soon, gray light filtering through the dusty window. Clara woke with a stiff neck and the sinking realization that nothing had changed. She was still stranded, still broke, still completely alone. She washed her face in the basin, changed into her other dress, not better, just different, and tried to make herself presentable. The mirror above the washstand showed her a woman who looked older than 23, with dark circles under her eyes and hair that no amount of pinning could make look elegant. Downstairs, the general store was already open. A few customers browsed the shelves, and Mrs. Chen stood behind the counter, sorting through a ledger. Clara approached carefully. "Mrs. Chen, I was wondering if you might know of any work available. Anything at all." Mrs. Chen didn't look up. "You can cook?" "Yes, and clean, sew, mend. I worked in a textile mill for 3 years. I know how to work hard." "Mill work's different from housework." "I know, but I learn fast, and I don't complain." Mrs. Chen finally looked at her, that same sharp, assessing gaze. "Garrett's an idiot." The blunt statement startled a laugh out of Clara. "Yes, he is. Town doesn't have much use for women who can't pay their way. You understand that?" Mrs. Chen's tone wasn't unkind, just factual. "Out here, everybody works or everybody starves. There's no in between. I want to work. I need to work. Restaurant might need a dishwasher. Pays terrible, but it's something." Mrs. Chen scribbled an address on a scrap of paper. "Ask for Martin. Tell him I sent you." Clara took the paper like it was a lifeline. "Thank you." The restaurant was at the far end of town, a squat building with a hand-painted sign that read Martin's. Inside, the smell of bacon grease and coffee was overwhelming. A handful of men sat at tables, shoveling food into their mouths, with the single-minded focus of people who had hard work ahead of them. The man behind the counter was enormous, 6.5 feet of muscle gone soft around the middle, with a beard that looked like it hadn't been trimmed in a decade. "You, Martin?" Clara asked. Depends who's asking. Clara Whitmore. Mrs. Chen sent me. She said you might need a dishwasher. Martin looked her over, his expression skeptical. You ever wash dishes for 50 men at a time? No, but I can learn. Pays 50 cents a day. You work from 5 in the morning till whenever we close, usually around 9. One meal included, but you eat whatever's left, not the good stuff. You steal food, you're fired. You break dishes, it comes out of your pay. You don't show up, you're fired. You understand? It was brutal, 16-hour days for pennies. But it was money, and money meant she could survive long enough to figure out what came next. I understand, Clara said. When do I start? Tomorrow morning, 5 sharp. You're late, don't bother coming at all. Clara worked that first day until her hands were raw and her back was screaming. The water was scalding, the lye soap ate at her skin, and the pile of dishes never seemed to get smaller. Martin wasn't cruel, but he wasn't kind either. He expected the work done right, done fast. When she finally stumbled back to her room above the general store that night, she collapsed onto the bed, still wearing her soaked dress, and fell asleep before she could even pull off her boots. The next day was the same, and the day after that. 3 days became a week became 2. Clara learned the rhythms of the restaurant, learned which customers were generous with tips, though tips were rare, and which ones would complain about anything just to hear themselves talk. She learned that Martin's bark was worse than his bite, that if she showed up on time and worked hard, he'd grumble, but he'd keep her on. She learned that Belridge was a town of miners and ranchers, men who'd come west chasing gold or land or just the chance to be left alone. There were few women, and most of them were either married or working at the saloon doing things Clara tried not to think too hard about. She learned that Thomas Garrett had opened his bank and married a woman from Denver within a month of Clara's arrival. The woman wore silk dresses and had family money. Thomas apparently looked very pleased with himself. Clara told herself she didn't care. Mostly, she was too tired to care. And then, 3 weeks after her arrival in Belridge, Caleb Rourke walked back into her life. He came into Martin's restaurant on a Saturday morning, dust on his clothes and exhaustion in his eyes. Clara was carrying a tray of dirty dishes back to the kitchen when she saw him slide into a seat at the counter. "Coffee," he said to Martin. "And whatever you've got that's hot." Martin grunted and poured the coffee. Clara kept moving, trying to be invisible. She'd seen Caleb a few times since that first day, hard not to in a town this small, but they'd never spoken. She'd gotten the impression he was avoiding town when he could, coming in only when necessary for supplies. "Miss Whitmore." His voice stopped her halfway to the kitchen. She turned, tray balanced on her hip. "Mr. Rourke." "You stayed." It wasn't a question. Apparently. Clara was suddenly conscious of how she must look, hair falling out of its pins, dress stained with dishwater, hands red and chapped. The train ticket east never materialized. "Garrett's a bastard." "Yes, he is." She shifted the tray. "If you'll excuse me." "I meant what I said. About work." Caleb wrapped his hands around his coffee mug, not looking at her. "If you're interested." Clara's first instinct was to refuse. She didn't need charity, didn't need pity. But then she thought about her hands, about the endless pile of dishes, about 50 cents a day and a room above a store that smelled like turpentine. "What kind of work?" she asked carefully. "Cooking, mostly, cleaning. I'm not—" He paused, seemed to be choosing his words. "I'm not looking for a wife, if that's what you're worried about. I've got a ranch that needs running, and I'm doing a piss-poor job of it on my own. I need help, real help. Someone who can cook something that doesn't taste like boot leather and keep the place from falling apart." "I don't know anything about ranching." "Don't need you to know about ranching. I've got 2 hands who help with the cattle. I need someone for the house." He finally looked at her, his expression neutral. "Room and board, plus $2 a week. It's not much, but it's more than you're making here." It was 4 times what she was making at Martin's. Room and board meant she wouldn't have to pay Mrs. Chen. It meant she could actually save money, maybe have choices again someday. "Why me?" Clara asked bluntly. "You don't know me. I could be a terrible cook. I could steal from you." "You could," Caleb agreed. "But you won't. You've got the look of someone who's too stubborn to fail at anything, even something you hate." He drained his coffee. "Offer stands until noon. After that, I'm heading back to the ranch, and I won't ask again." He stood, dropped coins on the counter for the coffee, and walked out. Clara stood there, tray still balanced on her hip, Martin's eyes boring into her back. "You gonna take it?" Martin asked. "I don't know." "Rourke's a good man. Quiet, keeps to himself, but decent. Lost his wife couple years back. Ranch has been going to hell since then." Martin started wiping down the counter. "Could do worse than working for him." Clara thought about that. About Caleb Rourke's weathered face and rough hands, and the careful distance he'd kept when making his offer. About $2 a week. About the possibility of something other than dishwater and exhaustion. "If I left," she said slowly, "would you give me my pay for this week?" Martin snorted. "You worked 4 days. I'll give you $2 even. Call it fair." $2 plus what little she'd managed to save. It wasn't much of a safety net, but it was something. Clara made her decision. At 1:45 she found Caleb Rourke loading supplies into a wagon outside the general store. He looked up when she approached, his expression unreadable. "I'll take the job," Clara said, "but I have conditions." One eyebrow went up. "Conditions?" "I want my own room, and I want it clear that this is work, nothing else. You said you weren't looking for a wife. I'm not looking for a husband. I just need honest work for honest pay." "Done." Caleb secured the last crate in the wagon. "Anything else?" "If it doesn't work out, you give me 2 weeks' notice before letting me go. Enough time to find something else." "Fair enough." He held out his hand. "We have a deal, Miss Whitmore." Clara shook his hand. His grip was firm, calloused, the hand of a man who worked for his living. "We have a deal, Mr. Rourke." "Caleb," he corrected. "If we're going to be working together, might as well use first names." "Clara, then." He nodded, climbed up onto the wagon seat, and held out a hand to help her up. Clara gathered her skirts and let him pull her up beside him. The trunk, her pitiful trunk with its pitiful contents, was already loaded in the back. As the wagon pulled away from Belridge, Clara looked back at the town that had rejected her, at the platform where Thomas Garrett had thrown her away, at Martin's restaurant and the general store, and the life she'd almost resigned herself to. She was headed into unknown territory with a stranger, toward a future she couldn't predict. It should have terrified her. Instead, for the first time in weeks, Clara Whitmore felt something that might have been hope. The ranch sat in a valley between 2 low ridges, 5 miles of rough track north of Belridge. Clara felt every rut and rock through the wagon seat as they climbed away from town, the horse plodding forward with the resigned patience of an animal that had made this journey too many times to count. Caleb didn't talk much. He'd pointed out a few landmarks, a creek that ran year-round, a stand of cottonwoods that marked the boundary of his land, a rock formation that looked like a broken tooth against the sky. But mostly he just drove, his hands easy on the reins, his attention on the rutted trail ahead. Clara was fine with the silence. It gave her time to wonder what the hell she'd just agreed to. Working for a stranger. Living on an isolated ranch with a man she'd spoken to exactly twice. It was reckless, possibly stupid, the kind of decision her mother would have called foolish beyond measure. But then again, coming west to marry Thomas Garrett had been foolish too. And at least this time she was going in with her eyes open. No promises, no expectations, just work for pay. The valley opened up in front of them as they crested the ridge, and Clara got her first look at what would be her home for the foreseeable future. The ranch house was smaller than she'd expected, a single-story structure of rough-hewn logs with a covered porch that sagged a little on one end. The roof looked solid enough, at least. Behind the house stood a barn that had seen better days, its paint long since weathered away to bare gray wood. A corral held a few horses, and beyond that she could see cattle grazing in the distance, dark shapes against the brown grass. It wasn't much, but it was more than Clara had expected, more than she'd had any right to hope for 3 weeks ago when she'd been standing on that platform with her entire life in ruins. "Needs work," Caleb said, the first words he'd spoken in over an hour. "Fair warning." "Everything needs work," Clara replied. "That's why you hired me." He glanced at her, something that might have been approval flickering across his face. "Guess that's true." The wagon rolled to a stop in front of the house. Caleb jumped down and came around to help Clara, but she was already climbing down on her own, her boots hitting the packed dirt with a solid thud. She might be working for him, but she wasn't going to be helpless about it. The front door stuck when Caleb pushed it open, scraping against the frame. Inside, the house was dim and cool, the windows shuttered against the afternoon sun. As Clara's eyes adjusted, she took in the main room, a stone fireplace that dominated one wall, a rough wooden table with mismatched chairs, a few shelves holding books and supplies. Everything was coated in a fine layer of dust. Kitchen's through there. Caleb gestured to a doorway on the left. 2 bedrooms down the hall. You can take the one at the end. It gets better light in the morning. Privy's out back. Water pumps by the barn. Clara walked through the main room slowly, her mind already cataloging what needed to be done. The floors needed sweeping, the windows needed opening, the whole place needed airing out. She could smell old smoke and stale air and something else. Loneliness, maybe? Or just the particular staleness of a house that had stopped being a home. The kitchen was worse than the main room. Dishes piled in the basin, all of them crusted with food that had gone hard. The stove was cold, its surface streaked with grease. Pots and pans hung from hooks on the wall, but they looked like they hadn't been properly cleaned in months. "I know it's bad," Caleb said from behind her. His voice had gone rough, defensive. "I've been meaning to get to it, but you've been running a ranch by yourself." Clara turned to face him. "When exactly were you supposed to find time to scrub pots?" He blinked, surprised. Most women would be horrified. "I've seen worse." Not much worse, but she wasn't going to tell him that. "I'll need soap, lye if you have it, and clean rags. There's supplies in the barn. I'll bring some up." He hesitated in the doorway. "Clara, if this isn't what you expected, if you want to go back to town—" "I don't." She cut him off, her tone firm. "I said I'd work, and I will, but I'm going to need you to stay out of my way while I do it." That almost smile flickered across his face again. "Yes, ma'am." He left her there, and Clara rolled up her sleeves and got to work. The first thing she did was open every window in the house, letting fresh air sweep through the stale rooms. Then she hauled water from the pump, bucket after bucket until her shoulders burned, and heated it on the stove. The dishes came first. She scrubbed them until her hands were raw, until every plate and cup and fork was clean enough to eat off. Then she tackled the floor, sweeping out dust and tracked in dirt, and what looked like the remains of several mice. By the time the sun started to sink toward the western ridge, the kitchen was almost habitable. Not perfect. The grease stains on the stove would need more work, and the floor could use a proper scrubbing, but better, cleaner, more like a place where people actually lived. Clara's back was screaming, and her hands were worse than they'd been after 2 weeks at Martin's, but there was satisfaction in it, the kind of bone-deep tiredness that came from accomplishment, not just endless repetition. She found Caleb in the barn, working on a broken harness by lamplight. He looked up when she approached, his hand stilling on the leather. "There's beans and salt pork in the pantry," he said. "I can cook something if you're hungry." "I'll do it." Clara leaned against the barn door, suddenly aware of how exhausted she was. "That's what you're paying me for." "You've been working all afternoon. I can manage beans." "Can you manage them so they're actually edible?" He grimaced. "Probably not." "Then let me cook." She pushed off from the doorframe. "One more thing, though. When's the last time you ate a vegetable that wasn't a potato?" Caleb had to think about it. "February, maybe? Mrs. Chen had some carrots." "It's August." "I know what month it is." "Do you know what scurvy is?" He set down the harness, his expression somewhere between amused and annoyed. "I'm not going to get scurvy." "You will if you keep eating nothing but beans and salt pork." Clara crossed her arms. "I'll make a list. You can pick up supplies next time you're in town." "Yes, ma'am," he said again, but this time there was something warmer in his voice. Not quite friendly, but not distant either. More like grudging respect. Dinner was simple, beans and salt pork like Caleb had said, but Clara fried the pork until it was crispy and added some wild onions she'd found growing near the pump. It wasn't fancy, but it was better than what Caleb had probably been eating, and he cleaned his plate without complaint. They ate in silence, the lamplight casting long shadows across the table. Outside, the night sounds of the ranch settled around them, cattle lowing in the distance, the wind moving through the cottonwoods, an owl calling from somewhere up on the ridge. "The men who help you with the cattle," Clara said finally. "When do they come around?" "Jack and Samuel show up most mornings. They've got their own places, but they help out here a few days a week." Caleb mopped up the last of the beans with a piece of bread. They'll probably want feeding if you're here cooking anyway. That's fine. How many people am I cooking for, usually? Just the three of us, most days. Sometimes four if we're doing something big like moving cattle or fixing fence. Clara nodded, already calculating quantities in her head. It was easier than cooking for 50 at Martin's at least. What time do they show up? Around 6, usually. Which meant she'd need to be up by 5 to have breakfast ready. Clara added it to the mental list of things she needed to adjust to. Early mornings, cooking for ranch hands, living in the middle of nowhere with a man who barely spoke. It should have felt overwhelming. Instead, it just felt like the next thing she had to do. After dinner, Caleb showed her to the bedroom he'd mentioned. A small square room at the end of the hall with a narrow bed, a dresser with a cracked mirror, and a window that looked out toward the eastern ridge. It was spare, almost bare, but it was clean, and it was private, and it was hers. "Belonged to my sister," Caleb said from the doorway. "Before she got married and moved to California." Clara set her trunk down at the foot of the bed. "She's not coming back?" "No." Something shifted in his expression, gone too fast for Clara to read. "She's got her own life now. This is just empty space." He left before Clara could respond, his boots heavy on the wooden floor. She heard the front door open and close, heard him walk across the porch and out into the night. Checking on the animals, probably, or just needing space away from having another person in his house. Clara understood that. She needed space too. She unpacked her trunk in the fading light. It didn't take long, she didn't own much, and then lay down on the bed fully clothed, too tired to even pull off her boots. Through the window she could see stars starting to appear, more stars than she'd ever seen in Philadelphia. So many they looked like someone had spilled salt across a black tablecloth. She fell asleep to the sound of wind and distance and the strange, vast quiet of the frontier night. The next morning came hard and early. Clara woke in darkness to the sound of a rooster screaming its head off somewhere near the barn. For a moment she didn't know where she was. The room was unfamiliar, the sounds were wrong, everything felt disorienting and strange. Then memory settled back into place, and she remembered. The ranch, Caleb Rourke, the job she'd agreed to. She dragged herself out of bed and splashed water on her face from the basin on the dresser, then made her way to the kitchen in the pre-dawn gray. The stove was cold. She'd need to get it going, get coffee started, figure out what to make for breakfast. By the time the sun started turning the sky pale, Clara had biscuits in the oven, bacon frying, and coffee boiling on the stove. The kitchen was warm from the fire, and the smell of cooking food was already chasing away some of the house's lingering staleness. Caleb appeared in the doorway just as she was pulling the biscuits out, his hair wet like he'd dunked his head in the water trough. "Smells good," he said. "It's just biscuits and bacon. Better than what I usually manage." He poured himself coffee, added sugar from a tin on the shelf. "Jack and Samuel will be here soon. Fair warning, they're going to ask you questions." "What kind of questions?" "The nosy kind." Caleb leaned against the counter, cradling his mug. Small towns, small ranches. Everybody wants to know everybody else's business. You don't have to answer if you don't want to. Clara appreciated the warning. She plated the bacon, started cracking eggs into the hot grease. "What did you tell them about me?" "That I hired you to cook and clean. That's it." "And they believed you?" "Probably not." He took a long drink of coffee. "But it's the truth, so that's all they're getting." The two ranch hands arrived just as Clara was setting plates on the table. Jack was older, maybe 50, with a face like weathered leather and eyes that didn't miss much. Samuel was younger, probably close to Clara's age, tall and gangly, with a nervous energy that reminded her of a colt that hadn't quite figured out its legs yet. They both stopped dead when they saw her. "Morning," Jack said slowly. "You must be the new help Caleb mentioned." "Clara Whitmore." She set down the last plate. "Breakfast is ready if you want to sit." They sat, but their attention was locked on Clara like she was some kind of exotic creature that had wandered onto the ranch by accident. She ignored them and brought over the biscuits, the bacon, the eggs, poured coffee for everyone. "This is real food," Samuel said, sounding amazed. "Actual real food." "As opposed to what?" Clara asked. "As opposed to whatever the hell Caleb's been calling food for the past 2 years. Jack bit into a biscuit and groaned. Christ, this is good. Where'd you learn to cook like this? My mother. And 3 years of figuring out how to make cheap ingredients taste like something worth eating. They ate like men who'd been half-starved for months, cleaning their plates and going back for seconds. Clara watched them with a mix of satisfaction and something else, a strange feeling that might have been belonging, or at least the early edges of it. She'd fed a lot of people at Martin's, but it had always been transactional, impersonal. This was different, smaller, more real. So how'd you end up out here? Jack asked, direct as a hammer. Philadelphia girl cooking on a ranch in the middle of nowhere. That's got to be a story. Caleb shot him a look. Jack! It's fine, Clara interrupted. She'd known this was coming. I came west to get married. The man changed his mind. I needed work. Caleb offered it. That's the whole story. That's the short version, Jack said. I'm guessing the long version's got more teeth to it. The long version isn't any of your business. Clara's tone was pleasant but firm. More coffee? Jack laughed, a rough bark of sound. I like her. She's got spine. Yeah, well, she's here to work, not be your entertainment. Caleb stood, draining the last of his coffee. We've got that fence line to check on the north pasture. Let's get moving. The 3 men headed out, and Clara was left alone with a table full of dirty dishes and a kitchen that already felt more lived in than it had the day before. She cleaned up, started water heating for laundry. Caleb had a pile of clothes that looked like they hadn't been washed in weeks, and tried to settle into the rhythm of this new life. The days developed a pattern after that. Clara woke before dawn, made breakfast, spent the daylight hours cleaning and cooking and trying to make the house feel less like a place where someone was just waiting to die, and more like somewhere people actually lived. The ranch hands came and went, always hungry, always grateful for real food. Caleb worked from sunup to sundown, checking cattle, mending fences, doing the 1,000 small tasks that kept a ranch running. They circled each other carefully, Clara and Caleb. Polite, professional. Like 2 people who'd agreed to share space but not lives. It should have felt lonely. Sometimes it did. Clara would catch herself staring out the window at the empty landscape, missing the noise and chaos of Philadelphia, missing having people around who knew her, who cared if she lived or died. But mostly she was too busy to be lonely, and there was satisfaction in the work, in making something better than it had been. A week passed, then 2. Clara learned the ranch's rhythms, learned which chores needed doing when, learned that Caleb liked his coffee black and his bacon crispy, and that he got quiet when he was tired, quieter when something was bothering him. She learned that Jack had a wife who died in childbirth 15 years ago and never remarried, that Samuel was saving money to buy his own land someday, that both of them treated Caleb with a respect that went deeper than just working for him. She learned that the ranch was struggling. Nothing Caleb said directly, but she could see it in the way he checked and rechecked the accounts in the evenings, in the careful way he measured out supplies, in the worn-out equipment that should have been replaced months ago. And she learned that Caleb Rourke was a better man than Thomas Garrett could ever hope to be. He paid her exactly what he'd promised, every week, counting out the money like it mattered. He never asked her to do anything he wouldn't do himself. He was gruff and quiet, and sometimes seemed like he'd forgotten other people existed, but he was fair, honest, decent. It was strange, realizing that decency could be such a rare thing. 3 weeks after Clara's arrival, a storm rolled in from the west. She saw it coming from the kitchen window, a wall of dark clouds building over the mountains, turning the afternoon sky the color of old bruises. The wind picked up, hot and restless, carrying the smell of rain that hadn't fallen yet. Caleb came in early, his face tight with worry. Storm's going to be bad. We need to get the horses into the barn, make sure everything's secured. Clara had never been through a frontier storm before, but she could feel the tension in the air, the building pressure that made her skin prickle. What do you need me to do? Close all the shutters, make sure the lamps are filled and ready. If the wind gets bad enough, we might lose the roof. He was already moving, grabbing his hat, checking the fastenings on the door. Stay inside once it hits. Don't go out for anything, understand? I'm not an idiot, Caleb. Didn't say you were. Just stay inside. He left, and Clara moved through the house, closing shutters, filling lamps, trying to ignore the growing unease in her gut. The sky was getting darker, the wind stronger. She could hear Caleb and the ranch hands shouting to each other over the rising noise, hear the horses whinnying nervously in the corral. The first drops of rain hit just as Caleb came back inside, slamming the door against the wind. He was soaked already, his shirt plastered to his chest, water dripping from his hair. "Jack and Samuel?" Clara asked. "Headed home before it gets worse." He stripped off his wet shirt, grabbed a dry one from the pile Clara had washed, and folded. "We're on our own till it passes." The storm hit like a freight train. Rain hammered the roof, so loud Clara had to shout to be heard. Wind screamed around the corners of the house, rattling the shutters, finding every crack and gap in the walls. Lightning turned the world white for split seconds at a time, followed by thunder that shook the floor beneath Clara's feet. She'd been through storms in Philadelphia, but nothing like this. Nothing so big, so violent, so utterly indifferent to the fragile human structures in its path. Caleb moved through the house, checking windows, reinforcing the door, his face grim. Clara stayed close to the fireplace, trying not to let her fear show. This was part of frontier life, she told herself. If she was going to survive out here, she'd have to get used to it. An hour into the storm, there was a crack so loud it sounded like the sky splitting open. Caleb swore and ran to the window, peering through the shutters. "What is it?" Clara shouted over the noise. "Lightning hit something. Can't see what. Too dark." They waited, tense and silent except for the roar of the storm. Clara could smell smoke now, faint but distinct. Something was burning. "The barn," Caleb said, his voice flat with dread. "The barn's on fire." He started for the door, but Clara grabbed his arm. "You said not to go outside." "I've got 6 horses in that barn." He shook her off, already pulling on his wet coat. "I'm not letting them burn." "Then I'm coming with you." "The hell you are. You need help." Clara was already grabbing her shawl, wrapping it around her shoulders. "Either we both go or we both stay, but you're not doing this alone." For a second, Caleb looked like he wanted to argue. Then another crack of lightning lit up his face, and Clara saw the fear there, the desperate calculation of a man who knew he might be about to do something very stupid and very necessary. "Stay behind me," he said roughly. "And if I tell you to run, you run. Understand?" Clara nodded. They plunged into the storm together. The rain hit like a wall of needles, cold and vicious. Clara could barely see 3 feet in front of her, could barely breathe against the wind. Caleb grabbed her hand and pulled her forward, toward the barn, toward the smoke that was now visible even through the driving rain. The barn doors were already burning, flames licking up the frame despite the downpour. Inside, Clara could hear the horses screaming. Caleb kicked the doors open, and smoke billowed out, thick and choking. He pulled his bandana up over his mouth and nose. "Get the horses out. I'll try to stop the fire from spreading." Clara stumbled into the smoke-filled barn, her eyes streaming, her lungs burning. She could barely make out the stalls through the haze, could barely hear anything over the roar of wind and rain and fire. But she could hear the horses, terrified and trapped, and that was enough. The first stall held a gray mare who tried to rear when Clara reached for her halter. Clara dodged the hooves, grabbed the rope, and pulled with everything she had. "Come on, girl! We gotta move! Come on!" The mare finally broke, lunging past Clara and out into the rain. Clara moved to the next stall and the next, her hands shaking, her whole body shaking, the smoke making her dizzy and sick. 4 horses out. 5. The last stall held Caleb's bay gelding, the one he rode every day. The horse was already panicking, eyes rolling white, foam flecking its mouth. Clara grabbed for the halter and the horse threw its head back, catching her across the shoulder hard enough to spin her around. Pain exploded through her arm, bright and sharp. Clara gasped, staggered, tried to reach for the halter again. The gelding reared, hooves flashing in the smoke. And then Caleb was there, pushing her aside, grabbing the horse's lead with practiced hands. "Get out!" he shouted at Clara. "Now!" Clara stumbled toward the door, her shoulders screaming, her lungs full of smoke. Behind her, she heard Caleb fighting with the gelding, heard the crack and groan of burning wood. She made it outside just as part of the roof collapsed. "Caleb!" Clara screamed, but the wind tore her voice away. She turned back toward the barn, toward the smoke and flames, and saw Caleb burst through the door with the gelding right behind him, both of them black with soot and wild-eyed with terror. They collapsed together in the mud, the rain pouring down, the barn burning like a bonfire behind them despite the storm's best efforts. For a long moment, neither of them could speak. They just lay there in the mud and the rain, breathing hard, alive. "You're an idiot," Clara finally managed. Caleb coughed, rolled onto his side. "You're the one who followed me into a burning building. Someone had to make sure you didn't die." "Yeah." He was looking at her through the rain and the smoke, something raw in his expression. "Yeah, I guess someone did." The storm raged on through the night, but the worst had passed. The barn burned down to its frame, but the rain kept it from spreading to the house. The horses huddled together in the corral, traumatized but alive. And Clara and Caleb sat on the porch in the darkness, wrapped in blankets, watching the last of the fire die out. "Thank you," Caleb said quietly, "for helping, for not listening when I told you to stay inside." Clara's shoulder throbbed where the horse had hit her, and her lungs still burned from the smoke, but she felt more alive than she had in months, more real. "You would have done the same for me," she said. "Yeah." Caleb pulled his blanket tighter around his shoulders. "I guess I would have." They sat in silence as the storm moved east, leaving destruction and mud and something else in its wake. Something that felt like the beginning of trust, fragile and uncertain. But there, morning came gray and cold, the sun struggling to burn through the haze of smoke still hanging over the valley. Clara woke on the porch where she'd finally fallen asleep sometime before dawn, her body stiff and aching, her shoulder a solid mass of pain where the horse had caught her. Caleb was already up, standing at the edge of the porch and staring at what remained of the barn. In daylight, the damage looked even worse. Blackened timber frames jutting up like broken ribs, ash and debris scattered across the muddy ground, the smell of wet charcoal thick enough to taste. "We can rebuild it," Clara said, her voice rough from smoke. Caleb didn't turn around. "With what money?" It was the first time he'd said it out loud, acknowledged the thing Clara had suspected for weeks. The ranch was barely hanging on financially, and losing the barn might be the blow that finally broke it. "How bad is it?" she asked. He was quiet for a long moment. "Bad enough that I've been considering selling off half the herd just to make it through winter. Now," he gestured at the ruins, "now I don't even have a place to store hay or shelter the horses when the real cold hits." Clara pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders. "There has to be something we can do." "We?" Caleb finally looked at her, and there was something raw in his face, something that looked like it hurt to show. "Clara, you don't owe me anything. I hired you to cook and clean, not to what? Care whether this place survives?" She stood up, ignoring the protest from her bruised shoulder. "I ran into a burning barn last night, Caleb. I think we're past the point of this being just a job." He stared at her like she'd said something in a foreign language, like the idea that someone might actually give a damn about his problems was so foreign he didn't know how to process it. "I don't know what to do," he said finally, and the admission seemed to cost him something. "I've been trying to keep this place going for 2 years, ever since—" He stopped, shook his head. "It doesn't matter. Point is, I'm out of options." "Then we find new options." Clara moved to stand beside him, looking out at the destroyed barn. "We figure it out. Together." The word hung between them, heavy with implications neither of them was quite ready to examine. Jack and Samuel arrived mid-morning, their faces grim when they saw the damage. They'd brought tools and what lumber they could spare from their own places, along with a determination that seemed to settle something in Caleb's expression. "We'll get it rebuilt," Jack said, surveying the wreckage with a practiced eye. "Won't be fancy, but it'll stand." "I can't pay you extra for this," Caleb said quietly. "You know that." "Didn't ask you to." Samuel was already pulling on work gloves. "That's what neighbors do out here. Help each other survive." They worked through the day, clearing debris, salvaging what timber could be saved, planning out where the new structure would go. Clara helped where she could, her shoulder protesting every movement, but she refused to sit idle while the men did all the work. She hauled smaller pieces of wood, sorted through nails and hardware, kept water and food coming so no one had to stop working. By the time the sun started sinking, they'd cleared most of the wreckage and laid out the foundation posts for the new barn. It wasn't much, but it was progress. It was hope, measured in salvaged timber and stubborn determination. That night, after Jack and Samuel had gone home and dinner was finished, Clara found Caleb sitting at the kitchen table with a ledger open in front of him. He was staring at the numbers like they might rearrange themselves into something more manageable if he just looked hard enough. "How much do you need?" Clara asked. He glanced up, surprised. "For what?" "To rebuild the barn and make it through winter. How much?" Caleb rubbed his face, exhaustion making him look older than his years. "More than I have. Even if we rebuild with salvaged timber and I sell off some cattle, I'm still looking at being short by at least $100. Maybe more. $100 might as well have been 1,000. Clara had been saving her wages carefully, but she had maybe $20 put away. Not enough to make a dent. "What about a loan?" she suggested. "From the bank in town?" "Thomas Garrett's bank?" Caleb's laugh was bitter. "He'd love that. Me coming in hat in hand begging for money. He'd probably give it to me too, just so he could foreclose when I couldn't pay it back and take the land for himself." Clara knew he was right. Thomas would see it as an opportunity, a chance to prove his superiority and grind someone else's face in the dirt. The thought made her angry in a way she hadn't let herself feel since that first day on the platform. "There has to be another way," she said. "If there is, I haven't found it." Caleb closed the ledger with a snap. "I'm sorry, Clara. I know you just got here, got settled. But if I lose this place, I can't keep paying you. You should probably start looking for other work, just in case." The words hit harder than Clara expected. The ranch had become more than just a job over the past month. It had become a home, or the closest thing to one she'd had since her parents died. The thought of losing it, of being cast adrift again, made something twist in her chest. "I'm not going anywhere," she said firmly. "Not yet. Not until we've tried everything." Caleb looked at her for a long moment, something shifting in his expression. "Why do you care so much? This isn't your fight." "Maybe I'm tired of running from fights." Clara sat down across from him. "Or maybe I just finally found something worth fighting for." The air between them felt charged suddenly, weighted with things neither of them knew how to say. Caleb's gaze held hers, and Clara saw the exact moment he understood what she was really saying, that this wasn't just about the ranch, that somewhere in the past month of cooking his meals and cleaning his house and learning the rhythms of his life, she'd started to care about more than just the work. "Clara," his voice was rough, uncertain. "Don't," she interrupted. "Don't say whatever you're about to say. Just, let's focus on saving the ranch. We can figure out the rest later." If there was a later. If they survived this. The next day brought another problem. Clara was in the garden behind the house, a scraggly patch of vegetables that she'd been trying to coax into productivity, when she heard horses approaching. She straightened, shading her eyes against the sun, and saw 3 riders coming up the track from town. Caleb emerged from the half-rebuilt barn, his expression wary. Jack and Samuel stopped working, their hands moving casually toward the rifles they kept nearby. Out here, unexpected visitors could mean anything from friendly neighbors to cattle thieves to worse. The lead rider was a man Clara didn't recognize. Middle-aged, well-fed, wearing clothes that were too nice for ranch work. The 2 men with him looked harder, meaner, the kind of men who got paid to intimidate people. "Caleb Rourke," the lead man called out. "That's me." Caleb's voice was carefully neutral. "What can I do for you?" The man dismounted, pulled a paper from his saddlebag. "Name's Harrison. I represent Mr. Thomas Garrett at the First Bank of Belridge. I'm here about your overdue mortgage payment." Clara felt her stomach drop. Overdue mortgage payment. Caleb hadn't mentioned that. "Payment's not due until the end of the month," Caleb said, but there was tension in his shoulders now. "That's true. But Mr. Garrett has concerns about the recent fire and your ability to maintain the property as collateral for the loan. He's asked me to conduct an inspection and assess whether the bank needs to call in the note early." It was a trap. Clara could see it clearly. Thomas had heard about the fire, saw an opportunity to squeeze Caleb, maybe even take the ranch for a fraction of what it was worth. The kind of calculated cruelty that Thomas Garrett specialized in. "You can't just call in a loan early because of fire damage," Jack said, stepping forward. "That's not legal." Harrison smiled, and it wasn't a pleasant expression. "There's a clause in Mr. Rourke's mortgage about maintaining the property in good condition. A burned-down barn could be considered a violation of that clause. Of course, If Mr. Rourke can pay off the balance of the loan immediately, this won't be an issue. How much? Caleb asked quietly. $340. Due within 30 days, or the bank will foreclose and take possession of the property. $340. Clara saw Caleb's face go pale, saw his hands clench into fists at his sides. There was no way. Even selling every head of cattle he owned wouldn't raise that much money that fast. This is Garrett's doing, Clara said, stepping forward. She was done being quiet, done letting men like Thomas Garrett destroy people's lives without consequence. He's using the bank to settle a personal grudge. Harrison turned to look at her, his eyes raking over her with barely concealed contempt. And you are? Clara Whitmore. I work here. Something flickered in Harrison's expression, recognition, maybe, or just satisfaction at having found another pressure point. Ah, yes, Miss Whitmore, the mail-order bride who wasn't good enough for Mr. Garrett. I can see why he passed. You do seem to have a talent for landing in desperate situations. The casual cruelty of it took Clara's breath away. Behind her, she heard Caleb move, heard the dangerous edge in his voice when he spoke. Get off my property. Harrison held up his hands in mock surrender. I'm just here to deliver a message, Mr. Rourke. You have 30 days to pay the balance of your loan or the bank will foreclose. Those are the terms. He climbed back onto his horse, his two companions following suit. I'll be back in a month to collect. I suggest you use the time wisely. They rode off, leaving a wake of tension and barely suppressed rage. Caleb stood there watching them go, his whole body rigid with fury. That son of a bitch, Jack said quietly. Garrett's trying to steal your land. He can't do this, Samuel added. There's got to be something. He can do it. Caleb's voice was flat, dead. The mortgage is legal, the clause is in there, and I don't have $340. He wins. No, Clara's voice cut through the despair like a knife. He doesn't win. Not like this. Caleb turned to look at her, and the hopelessness in his eyes nearly broke her. Clara, there's nothing, there's always something. She was thinking fast now, her mind racing through possibilities. We have a month. That's time enough to figure this out. Figure out what? How to magic up money we don't have? No. How to raise it? Clara grabbed his arm, forcing him to look at her. The cattle. You said you were thinking about selling half the herd anyway. What if we sell more? All of them if we have to. Even if I sold every cow I own, it wouldn't be enough. And then I'd have no way to make money next year. No way to pay you or rebuild or... He stopped, shook his head. It's over, Clara. I need to accept that. Like hell it is. Jack's voice was hard. We didn't spend the last 2 days rebuilding that barn just to watch Garrett steal this place. There's got to be a way to raise the money. What about Fort Collins? Samuel suggested. They've got a big cattle auction in 2 weeks. Prices are supposed to be good this year because of the railroad coming through. Caleb's expression shifted, hope and calculation warring on his face. Even at good prices, I'd need to sell damn near everything. And I'd have to drive the cattle there myself. Can't afford to pay drovers. So we go with you, Jack said. The 4 of us. We can manage the herd between us. I can't ask you to. You're not asking. We're offering. Jack looked at Samuel, who nodded. We're in this together, Caleb. That's how it works. Clara felt something warm bloom in her chest, watching these men stand up for each other, refuse to let one of their own fall. This was what community meant out here. Not polite society gatherings or social climbing, but real support when it mattered most. I'll stay here and keep working on the barn, Clara said. Keep the place running while you're gone. Caleb shook his head. You'll come with us. What? Why? Because I'm not leaving you alone on an isolated ranch for 2 weeks with Garrett knowing I'm gone. His voice was firm. You're coming with us, or the whole plan's off. Clara wanted to argue, wanted to insist she could take care of herself. But the memory of Harrison and his 2 hard-eyed companions was fresh in her mind, and she knew Caleb was right. Thomas Garrett had already proven he'd use whatever leverage he could find. Leaving her alone would just give him another opportunity. Fine, she said. I'll come, but I'm not just going to sit in a wagon and watch. I'll help drive the cattle. You don't know how to drive cattle. Then you'll teach me. Clara crossed her arms, daring him to argue. We're wasting time, Caleb. Either we do this together or we don't do it at all. For the first time since Harrison had delivered his ultimatum, something like a smile flickered across Caleb's face. You're stubborn as hell, you know that? I've been told. Clara smiled back, feeling the tension ease slightly. So when do we leave? Day after tomorrow. Gives us time to round up the cattle and get supplies together. Caleb looked at Jack and Samuel. You two sure about this? Hell yes, Samuel said. Always wanted to see Fort Collins anyway. Just try to stop us, Jack added. They spent the next 2 days in a flurry of preparation, rounding up cattle that had scattered across the range, sorting out which animals were strong enough for the drive and which needed to be left behind, gathering supplies, packing food and bedrolls and everything they'd need for 2 weeks on the trail. Clara helped where she could, learning to rope and ride better than she had before, her hands blistering and her muscles screaming, but her determination never wavering. The night before they were set to leave, Clara found Caleb standing by the corral, watching the horses. The moon was up, painting everything in shades of silver and shadow. Can't sleep? She asked, coming to stand beside him. Too much to think about. He rested his arms on the top rail of the fence. This is a hell of a gamble, Clara. If we don't get enough for the cattle, if something goes wrong on the drive, if Garrett finds another way to screw us, then we'll deal with it. Clara leaned against the fence next to him. But sitting here worrying about all the ways it could fail isn't going to help anything. I know. He was quiet for a moment. I'm sorry I dragged you into this mess. You came here for a simple job, and instead you're about to spend 2 weeks driving cattle across rough country, all to save a ranch that might be lost anyway. I'm not sorry, Clara said honestly. A month ago, I was washing dishes for 50 cents a day and sleeping in a room above a general store. I had nothing and no one. Now I have... She paused, trying to find the right words. Now I have something worth fighting for. Even if we lose, at least I fought. Caleb turned to look at her, and in the moonlight his eyes were dark and unreadable. You could have gone back east, taken Garrett's ticket, gone home. I didn't have a home to go back to, just a place I used to live. Clara held his gaze. This ranch, Caleb, it's the first place that's felt like home since my parents died. I'm not ready to give that up without a fight. Something shifted in the space between them. Caleb reached out slowly, carefully, like he was afraid she might bolt. His hand brushed her cheek, rough and warm. Clara, don't, she whispered. Not yet. Not until we know if we're going to make it through this. What if I want to say it anyway? Then save it. Clara caught his hand, squeezed it. Save it for when we've won. When we've beaten Garrett and saved the ranch and we can actually afford to think about what comes next. Caleb's thumb traced her cheekbone, and Clara felt the touch all the way down to her bones. And what do you think comes next? I don't know, she admitted, but I want to find out. He leaned in slowly, giving her time to pull away. Clara didn't. When his lips met hers, it was gentle, tentative, like they were both afraid of breaking something fragile. The kiss tasted like hope and desperation, and the kind of future neither of them had let themselves imagine. When they pulled apart, Caleb rested his forehead against hers. We're going to make it through this, he said quietly. All of it. I promise. Don't make promises you can't keep. Then I'll make damn sure I can keep it. They stood there in the moonlight, holding on to each other and the possibility of something neither of them dared name yet. Tomorrow they'd start the drive. Tomorrow they'd begin the fight to save everything they'd built. But tonight, for just a few moments, they let themselves imagine what winning might feel like. The drive started before dawn, 60 head of cattle moving out across the range with 4 riders keeping them together. Clara had never done anything like this before. The constant motion, the dust, the need to stay alert every second to keep the animals from scattering. Her horse, a patient mare named Rosie that Caleb had picked out specifically for her, seemed to understand that Clara was learning, responding to her clumsy commands with more grace than they deserved. Jack took point, leading the herd with the ease of someone who'd been doing this his whole life. Samuel rode the left flank, Caleb the right. Clara brought up the rear, her job to catch any stragglers and keep the back of the herd moving. It was exhausting. By midday, Clara's legs ached from gripping the saddle. Her face was coated with dust, and she was pretty sure she'd never get the smell of cow out of her clothes. But there was something exhilarating about it, too. The wide open sky, the movement of the herd, the way the four of them worked together like parts of a single machine. They made camp that first night by a creek, the cattle settling down to graze while the humans collapsed around a small fire. Clara's hands shook as she tried to cook dinner. Just beans and cornbread, nothing fancy, but no one complained. They were all too tired to care. "You did good today," Caleb said quietly, handing her his empty plate. "Better than I expected." I can't tell if that's a compliment or an insult. Compliment. Most people from back east would have given up by noon. Clara smiled despite her exhaustion. "I'm too stubborn to give up." "Yeah." Caleb's expression softened. "I'm starting to notice that about you." The days blurred together after that. Long hours in the saddle, dust and sun, and the constant need to keep the cattle moving. They crossed creeks and navigated rocky terrain and dealt with a bull that decided to make a break for freedom halfway through day 3. Clara learned to read the land the way Caleb and Jack did, learned to anticipate where the cattle would try to scatter, learned to push through exhaustion and keep going because stopping wasn't an option. At night, they took turns on watch, making sure the cattle didn't wander and that no predators got close. Clara volunteered for the late shift, the hours before dawn when the world was dark and quiet and full of stars. Caleb joined her sometimes, sitting by the dying fire and talking about nothing important. The ranch, the weather, stories from his past that he'd never shared before. "My wife died in childbirth," he said one night, the words coming out of nowhere. 2 years ago. The baby didn't make it either." Clara went still, afraid that if she moved or spoke, he'd stop talking. "I loved her," Caleb continued, staring into the fire. "Sarah. We grew up together, got married when we were 20. She wanted kids so bad, wanted a house full of them. When she finally got pregnant, she was so happy." His voice cracked. "And then she died. And I didn't know how to be in that house anymore. How to keep going when everything I'd built was supposed to be for her." "I'm sorry," Clara whispered. "I'm telling you because you should know why the ranch is such a mess, why I'm so—" He gestured vaguely. "Why I don't know how to do this." "Do what?" "Feel something for someone again." He looked at her finally, his eyes reflecting the firelight. "I'm scared, Clara. Scared of losing the ranch, yeah, but more scared of—" He stopped, shook his head. "Never mind, forget I said anything." "Scared of caring about me?" Clara finished quietly. "Because you're worried you'll lose me too?" Caleb's silence was answer enough. Clara moved closer, took his hand. "You might lose me. That's how life works. But you also might not. And spending all your time being scared of the second option means missing out on whatever good might come from the first." "When did you get so wise?" "I'm not wise. I'm just tired of being afraid all the time." Clara squeezed his hand. "We both deserve better than that." They sat there in the darkness, hands linked, not saying anything else because there wasn't anything else that needed saying. The cattle shifted and settled. The fire burned down to embers, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled at the moon. On the 8th day, they ran into trouble. They'd stopped to water the cattle at a river crossing when Clara noticed riders on the far bank. 3 of them, watching, waiting. "Caleb," she said quietly, not taking her eyes off the men. He'd already seen them. "Jack, Samuel, get the cattle across, now." There was no discussion, no questions. Jack and Samuel immediately started pushing the herd into the water, while Caleb moved his horse between Clara and the strangers, his hand resting casually on the rifle strapped to his saddle. The 3 riders crossed the river, water splashing up around their horses' legs. They were rough-looking men, the kind Clara had seen in Belridge sometimes. Drifters, maybe. Or worse. "That's a nice herd you got there," the lead rider said. He was big, bearded, with eyes that reminded Clara of a snake. "Headed to Fort Collins." "That's right," Caleb said evenly. "Dangerous country between here and there. Easy for things to go wrong." The man smiled, showing tobacco-stained teeth. "We could provide protection, for a fee." "We don't need protection." "I think you do." The man's gaze slid past Caleb to Clara. "Especially traveling with a woman. Never know what kind of trouble you might run into." The threat was barely veiled. Clara felt ice slide down her spine, felt Rosie shift nervously beneath her. Across the river, Jack and Samuel had gotten the cattle to the far bank, but they were too far away to help if things went bad. "We're not interested," Caleb said, and there was steel in his voice now. "And we've got somewhere to be, so if you'll excuse us, I don't think you understand." The bearded man's hand moved toward his gun. "This isn't a request." Everything happened very fast after that. Caleb's rifle was up and aimed before the man's hand reached his holster. "Touch that gun and you're dead," he said flatly. "All three of you. Now turn around and right away before this gets ugly." For a long moment, nobody moved. The tension stretched tight as a wire, one wrong word away from snapping. Claire's heart hammered in her chest, her hands clenched on the reins. Then the bearded man laughed, but it wasn't a real laugh. Another time, maybe. They wheeled their horses and rode off, but Clara knew this wasn't over. Men like that didn't give up that easily. "Cross the river," Caleb said urgently. "Fast as you can." Clara didn't argue. She kicked Rosie into motion, the mare plunging into the water with more courage than Clara felt. The current was stronger than it looked, tugging at them, trying to sweep them downstream. Clara clung to the saddle, her heart in her throat, until Rosie's hooves found purchase on the far bank, and they scrambled up onto dry ground. Caleb was right behind her, his face grim. "We need to move. Put distance between us and them before they decide to come back with friends." They pushed the herd hard for the rest of the day, not stopping until well after dark. Everyone was on edge, jumping at shadows, hands never far from weapons. Clara took first watch that night, her eyes straining against the darkness, every sound making her pulse spike. Nothing happened. The men didn't come back, but the encounter had shaken something loose, reminded all of them how vulnerable they were out here. "Tomorrow, we'll be close enough to Fort Collins that we should be safe," Caleb said when he came to relieve Clara for the next watch. "Just have to make it through one more night. And if they come back before then? Then we fight." He said it simply, like it was just another fact of life out here. "And we win, because losing isn't an option." Clara wanted to believe him, wanted to believe they could overcome every obstacle, beat every threat. But she was tired and scared and starting to wonder if they'd taken on more than they could handle. As if reading her thoughts, Caleb pulled her close, his arms solid and warm around her. "We're going to make it, Clara. All of us. I promise." "You said not to make promises you can't keep." "I also said I'd make damn sure I could keep it." He pressed a kiss to her forehead. "Get some sleep. Tomorrow we finish this." Tomorrow they'd reach Fort Collins. Tomorrow they'd sell the cattle and find out if they'd raised enough money to save the ranch. Tomorrow they'd know if any of this had been worth it. Fort Collins appeared on the horizon like a mirage, buildings shimmering in the heat haze as they drove the herd down the final stretch of road. Clara had never been so relieved to see a town in her life. Every muscle in her body ached, her face was burned raw from the sun, and she was pretty sure she'd be picking dust out of her hair for the next month. But they'd made it. All 60 head of cattle, all 4 of them, intact and alive. The stockyard sat on the eastern edge of town, a sprawling complex of pens and loading chutes where hundreds of cattle milled about, waiting for the auction. The noise was overwhelming after days of open prairie, cattle bawling, men shouting, the clang of metal gates and the whistle of trains in the distance. Caleb found the yard manager, a weathered man named Porter, who looked them over with the practiced eye of someone who'd seen every type of rancher the West had to offer. 60 head? Porter consulted a ledger, made a notation. "Auctions tomorrow morning. Get them penned in Section 12. Make sure they got water. You'll want to register them tonight if you're hoping for a good slot." "What are prices running?" Caleb asked, trying to sound casual, but Clara could hear the tension underneath. Porter shrugged. "Depends on the quality. Good stock's been going for $8, maybe $9 a head. Scrawny stuff, less. Railroad buyers are picky this year. $8 a head." Clara did the math quickly in her head. 60 head at $8 was $480, more than enough to pay off Garrett's loan with money left over. But that was assuming they got top price, assuming the buyers thought Caleb's cattle were worth it. "They're good stock," Jack said firmly, reading Clara's worry. "Best damn cattle in the territory." Porter smiled, not unkindly. "That's what everyone says. But the buyers decide, not me. Good luck tomorrow." They got the cattle settled in the pens, made sure they had water and hay. By the time they finished, the sun was setting, and Clara felt like she might actually fall asleep standing up. "There's a boarding house 2 streets over," Caleb said, counting out coins from a pouch at his belt. "Clean beds, decent food. We'll get rooms there tonight. Get cleaned up before the auction." "I can sleep in the wagon," Clara protested. "Save the money." "No." Caleb's tone left no room for argument. "You've been sleeping on the ground for 9 days. Tonight you get a real bed." The boarding house was run by a stern-faced woman named Mrs. Murphy, who took one look at their dusty, trail-worn group and quoted a price that made Caleb wince. But he paid it, and Clara found herself being shown to a small room on the second floor with an actual bed, actual sheets, and a basin of clean water for washing. She locked the door, stripped off her filthy clothes, and scrubbed herself as clean as she could manage with just a basin and a cloth. When she looked in the mirror, she barely recognized herself. Her face was darker than it had ever been, burned by sun and wind. Her hair was a disaster. Her hands were calloused and scarred from rope burns. She looked like someone who belonged out here, someone who'd earned their place through work and stubbornness. She looked like a rancher's wife. The thought hit her unexpectedly, making her breath catch. Was that what she wanted? To spend the rest of her life on that ranch, cooking for cowboys and fighting against the land and the weather and men like Thomas Garrett? A month ago, the idea would have seemed insane. Now it felt like the only thing that made sense, if they still had a ranch to go back to. If tomorrow went well. If. Clara dressed in her cleanest clothes, which wasn't saying much, and went down to dinner. The boarding house dining room was crowded with ranchers and buyers, the air thick with cigar smoke and loud conversation. She found Caleb, Jack, and Samuel at a corner table, already working their way through plates of stew and bread. "Feel better?" Caleb asked as she sat down. "I feel human again." Clara accepted a bowl of stew from Mrs. Murphy. "That's about all I can ask for." They ate in companionable silence, too tired for much conversation. Around them, Clara heard snatches of talk about cattle prices, railroad schedules, the quality of different herds. Everyone here was gambling their livelihood on tomorrow's auction, betting that they'd done enough, worked hard enough, been lucky enough to come out ahead. After dinner, Caleb walked Clara up to her room. They stood in the hallway, neither quite ready to say goodnight. "Tomorrow decides everything," Clara said quietly. "I know." Caleb leaned against the wall, exhaustion evident in every line of his body. "I've been doing math in my head all day. If we get $8 ahead, we're fine. 7, we're cutting it close. Anything less than 6, and we're sunk." "Then we'll get 8. Clara tried to sound confident. "Porter said good stock goes for 8 or 9. Our cattle are good." "They're decent, but decent might not be enough." He rubbed his face. "I'm sorry, Clara. You shouldn't be worried about this. It's my problem, my debt." "Stop." Clara grabbed his hand. "I told you before, this isn't just your problem anymore. We're in this together. Whatever happens tomorrow, we face it together." Caleb pulled her close, his arms wrapping around her like he was afraid she might disappear. Clara pressed her face against his chest, listening to his heartbeat, steady and strong despite everything. "I don't deserve you," he said quietly. "Probably not." Clara smiled against his shirt. "But you're stuck with me anyway." He laughed, a real laugh, and the sound of it made something warm bloom in Clara's chest. They stood there in the hallway, holding each other, until Mrs. Murphy's pointed cough from downstairs reminded them that respectable boarding houses had rules about unmarried men and women lingering in hallways. "Get some sleep," Caleb said, reluctantly letting her go. "Tomorrow we win." "Tomorrow we win," Clara echoed, and she went into her room believing it. The auction started at 8 in the morning, the stockyard already packed with buyers and sellers by the time Clara and the others arrived. The air smelled of cattle and hay and nervous sweat. A makeshift platform had been erected at one end of the main pen, where an auctioneer in a too-tight vest was already working through the first lots of cattle. Caleb's herd was scheduled for mid-morning. They waited, watching other sales, trying to gauge the mood of the buyers. Some herds went for good prices, others for less than expected. The pattern seemed random, dependent on factors Clara couldn't quite identify. "Lot 47, the auctioneer finally called. 60 head from the Rourke Ranch, Belridge area. Good breeding stock, grass-fed, ready for shipment. Caleb's cattle were driven into the main pen. They looked good, Clara thought. Healthy, well-muscled, better than some of the scrawny animals she'd seen go through earlier. But would the buyers see that? The bidding started slow. $6. A competing buyer raised it to $6.50. Then $7. Clara's heart was pounding, her hands clenched so tight her nails bit into her palms. $7.50. $8. The bidding stalled. The auctioneer looked around, trying to coax more offers. $8. Do I hear $8.50? Quality stock here, gentlemen. Ready for the railroad. $8.50? Silence. Clara felt her stomach drop. $8 a head was $480. They needed at least $340 to pay the loan, but that wouldn't leave much for rebuilding or getting through winter or paying wages. Going once at $8, the auctioneer called. $8.50. The voice came from the back of the crowd. Clara turned and saw a well-dressed man she didn't recognize, a railroad buyer by the look of his fancy suit and pocket watch. $8.50. We have $8.50. Do I hear $9? Another buyer, this one representing a big ranch up north, raised his hand. $9. $9. Do I hear $9.50? The railroad man nodded. $9.50. Clara could barely breathe. $9.50 a head would be $570. More than enough for everything they needed. $9.50, going once, going twice, $10. The crowd turned to look at the new bidder, and Clara's blood ran cold. Standing at the edge of the stockyard, looking smug and perfectly groomed despite the dust and chaos, was Thomas Garrett. Caleb went rigid beside her. What the hell is he doing here? Causing trouble, Jack muttered. Same as always. The auctioneer looked pleased at the spike in price. $10. Do I hear $10.50? The railroad man shook his head, stepping back. The northern rancher did the same. $10 a head was too rich for most buyers, which meant either Garrett would win the bid and Caleb would get his money, or Clara saw it a split second before it happened. Saw the calculation in Thomas Garrett's eyes, the cold satisfaction of a man about to twist the knife. Actually, Garrett called out, I withdraw my bid. Apologies, auctioneer. I was mistaken about the quality of this particular lot. The crowd muttered, confused. The auctioneer frowned. Sir, you can't just... I can and I am. I'm not interested in this lot after all. Which meant the winning bid reverted to the last legitimate offer, $9.50 from the railroad man. But the railroad man was already shaking his head. I'm out too, he said. Price is too unstable. I'll wait for the next lot. The auctioneer looked frustrated, but there wasn't much he could do. Do I have any other bids? Current offer is $9 from the northern ranch. Going once? $7, a new voice called. A buyer Clara hadn't noticed before, probably looking for a bargain now that the big spenders had backed out. $7. Any advance on 7? Silence. The crowd had moved on, attention already shifting to the next lot. Caleb's cattle, his entire herd, everything he'd worked for and risked to get here was about to sell for barely enough to pay the loan and nothing more. Going once at $7, the auctioneer said, impatient now. Going twice? Wait! Clara didn't realize she was going to speak until the word was already out of her mouth. Every head in the stockyard turned to look at her. We need to pull the lot. We're not selling at that price. The auctioneer's frown deepened. Miss, you can't just pull a lot once bidding has started. The hell she can't, Caleb said, finding his voice. Those are my cattle, and I'm withdrawing them from auction. We're done here. You'll forfeit your registration fee, the auctioneer warned. I don't care. We're not selling. They left the stockyard to the sound of muttering and speculation, Thomas Garrett's laughter following them out. Clara felt numb, her mind racing. They'd come all this way, risked everything, and for what? They were right back where they started, except now they had even less time and Garrett knew exactly how desperate they were. I'm going to kill him, Caleb said quietly. I'm going to find him, and I'm going to put a bullet in him. You're not going to do that, Jack said firmly. Because then you'd hang, and Garrett would still win. We need another plan. There is no other plan. Caleb's control finally snapped, his voice rising. That was it. That was the only way to raise the money, and Garrett just destroyed it because he can. Because he knew exactly what we needed, and he made damn sure we didn't get it. Claire's mind was working frantically, sorting through possibilities, discarding the impossible, looking for any angle they'd missed. What if we sell the cattle privately, she suggested. Skip the auction, find buyers directly? In one day? Samuel shook his head. Even if we could find buyers willing to pay fair price, which is unlikely now that everyone saw us pull from auction, we'd never get through enough of the herd fast enough. Then we take them back, Clara said. Drive them home, sell them off gradually over the winter. It'll take longer, but... We don't have longer, Caleb interrupted, his voice hollow. We have 3 weeks until Garrett forecloses. Even if we sold a few head a week, it wouldn't be enough. They stood there in the street outside the stockyard, 4 people who'd fought so hard and come so close, now staring at the wreckage of their last hope. There has to be something, Clara insisted, but even she was starting to lose faith. There isn't. Caleb looked at her, and the defeat in his eyes nearly broke her. It's over, Clara. We lost. Before Clara could respond, a man approached them, the railroad buyer who'd bid $9.50 before withdrawing. He was older, maybe 60, with shrewd eyes and an air of authority that suggested he was used to getting what he wanted. Mr. Rourke, he said, I'm Edmund Price, chief buyer for the Denver and Rio Grande Railway. I'd like to speak with you about your cattle. Caleb's jaw tightened. If you're here to offer me $5 a head now that everyone knows I'm desperate, I'm here to offer you $9 a head, Price interrupted calmly. Private sale, cash payment today, but I need an answer now because I have other lots to evaluate and my time is limited. Claire's heart leaped. $9 a head would be $540. Enough to pay the loan, rebuild, make it through winter. Enough to survive. Why? Caleb asked suspiciously. Why would you pay $9 when you could probably get them for $7 or less now? Price smiled slightly. Because I'm not interested in stealing from desperate men, Mr. Rourke. I'm interested in quality cattle at fair prices. Your herd is good stock. I evaluated them before the auction, and I stand by that assessment. The drama with Garrett was unfortunate, but it doesn't change the quality of your animals. Garrett's a friend of yours? Garrett's a small-minded fool who enjoys making other people miserable. I have no use for men like that. Price pulled out a wallet, extracted a stack of bills. $9 a head for all 60. Take it or leave it, but decide now. Caleb looked at Clara, at Jack, at Samuel. Clara could see the war in his expression, suspicion fighting against desperate hope, pride battling with practicality. Take it, Clara said quietly. Take the deal. Caleb turned back to Price. $10 a head, and you've got a deal. Price's eyebrows rose. You're in no position to negotiate, Mr. Rourke. Maybe not, but my cattle are worth it, and we both know it. You wouldn't be making this offer if they weren't. Caleb's voice was steady now, certain. $10 or we walk away and take our chances somewhere else. For a long moment, Price just looked at him. Then he laughed, a genuine sound of appreciation. You've got spine, I'll give you that. He pulled out more bills, counted them carefully. $10 a head, $600 total. You drive them to the railroad pens by this afternoon, and we have a deal. They shook hands, and Clara felt tears prick her eyes. $600. They'd done it. They'd actually done it. The transfer happened quickly after that. Cattle driven to the railroad pens, counted and inspected, money changing hands and crisp bills that Caleb counted twice before tucking safely into his coat pocket. By late afternoon, it was official. The cattle were sold, the money was theirs, and they had enough to save the ranch with $160 to spare. We should celebrate, Samuel suggested. There's a restaurant down the street that's supposed to be decent. But Clara had seen Thomas Garrett watching from across the stockyard, his expression murderous. Garrett had tried to destroy them and failed, but he wasn't the type to accept defeat gracefully. We should get out of town, she said. Now, before Garrett tries something else. She's right, Jack agreed. Man like that, he's not done causing trouble. We got what we came for. Let's get it home before he figures out a way to take it from us. They left Fort Collins within the hour, riding hard, pushing their horses faster than was probably wise. Clara kept looking over her shoulder, expecting to see riders following them, but the road behind stayed empty. Maybe Garrett had accepted defeat, or maybe he was just planning something worse. They made camp that first night in a rocky canyon that offered some protection, taking turns on watch, everyone nervous and on edge. But nothing happened. No riders appeared. No threats materialized. By the second day, Clara started to believe they might actually make it home safely. They were following a ridge line, the horses picking their way along a narrow trail when Caleb suddenly held up his hand for silence. Clara froze, listening. At first she heard nothing but wind and the creak of saddle leather. Then she smelled it. Smoke. "Something's burning," Jack said, standing in his stirrups to see better. "West of here, maybe 2 miles." Caleb's face had gone pale. "That's the direction of the ranch." They kicked their horses into a gallop, racing along the ridge and down into the valley, the smell of smoke getting stronger with every mile. Clara's heart was pounding, dread building in her chest like a physical weight. Please no, she thought. Please not the ranch, not after everything. They crested the final rise and Clara's worst fear materialized in front of them. The ranch was burning. Not just the remains of the old barn, but the house itself, flames shooting from the windows, black smoke pouring into the sky. Clara could see it from a mile away, a beacon of destruction that turned her blood to ice. "No!" Caleb spurred his horse forward, racing down the slope with reckless abandon. Clara followed, branches whipping her face, rocks threatening to trip her horse. But she didn't slow down. They had to get there, had to save what they could, had to... They were still a quarter-mile away when the house roof collapsed, sending up a shower of sparks and a roar of flame that Clara could feel from where she was. The sound was terrible, final, the death cry of everything they'd fought to preserve. Caleb pulled his horse to a stop at the edge of the yard, close enough to feel the heat but too far to do anything about it. The house was completely engulfed, flames consuming timber and memory with equal indifference. The barn frame they'd been rebuilding was burning too, along with the corral fence and what looked like most of the outbuildings. Everything was gone. Clara dismounted on shaking legs, staring at the destruction. This wasn't an accident. Someone had done this deliberately, thoroughly, making sure nothing would be left to salvage. "Garrett," Caleb said, his voice dead. "It had to be Garrett." "We don't know that," Jack started, but even he didn't sound convinced. "Who else would it be?" Caleb's hands were clenched into fists, his whole body trembling with rage. He couldn't steal the ranch through the bank, couldn't drive down the price of the cattle enough to ruin us, so he burned it all down instead. Burned it all down so even with the money, we'd have nothing left to save. Clara wanted to argue, wanted to say there had to be another explanation, but she couldn't. This had Garrett written all over it, the timing too perfect, the destruction too complete. He'd known they were gone, known exactly when to strike. "The horses," Samuel said suddenly. "Where are the horses we left behind?" They found them 1/2 mile away, driven off but alive. Someone had at least cared enough not to let the animals burn. Small mercy in the face of total devastation. As the sun set, the 4 of them sat on the ridge above the ranch and watched the fire burn itself out. There was nothing to do but wait, nothing to save. By morning, there would be nothing left but ash and charred timber and the smoking ruins of everything Caleb had built. "I'm sorry," Clara said, her voice breaking. "I'm so sorry." Caleb didn't answer. He just sat there, staring at the destruction, his expression empty in a way that scared Clara more than rage would have. They'd fought so hard, risked so much, come so close to winning, and in the end, it hadn't mattered at all. The dawn came gray and cold, revealing the full scope of the destruction. Where the house had stood, there was nothing but a blackened shell. Walls collapsed inward, the stone fireplace standing alone like a grave marker. The barn frame was gone completely, reduced to charred posts and ash. Even the garden Clara had worked so hard to coax into life was trampled and burned, the earth scorched black. Caleb stood in what used to be the main room, his boots crunching on debris, and Clara watched him from a distance. He hadn't spoken since the night before, hadn't eaten, hadn't slept, just sat on that ridge watching his life burn until there was nothing left to watch. "We should head into town," Jack said quietly, standing beside Clara. "File a report with the sheriff, at least, even if nothing comes of it." "What's the point?" Clara's voice was hollow. "We all know who did this, and we all know nothing will happen to him." "Maybe not, but we can't just..." Jack stopped, shook his head. "I don't know, Clara. I don't know what we're supposed to do here. Samuel had already started gathering what little could be salvaged. A few tools that had survived, some tin plates that were warped but usable, a water pump that had somehow escaped the flames. It was pitiful, the remnants of an entire life fitting into a single pile barely 3 feet high. "Caleb!" Clara called out. She couldn't stand watching him stand there anymore. Couldn't stand the emptiness in his expression. "Come on, we need to make a plan." He turned to look at her, and the grief in his eyes nearly broke her. "What plan? There's nothing left to plan for." "We still have the money from the cattle sale. We can what?" His voice was raw, angry now, which was somehow better than the empty silence. "Build a house with $600? That won't even cover lumber, let alone everything else we'd need. The barn, the fences, the equipment, it's all gone, Clara, all of it." "Then we start smaller. Build one room first, then another. Get the basics up before winter." "And live where while we're building? Sleep on the ground? Cook over an open fire?" Caleb kicked at a piece of charred wood, sending up a cloud of ash. "Face it, we're done. Garrett won after all." Clara felt something crack inside her chest, hot and fierce. "So that's it? You're just going to give up? After everything we went through to save this place, you're going to let him win because the fight got harder?" "It's not about the fight getting harder," Caleb's voice rose. "It's about knowing when you're beat. We don't have the resources to rebuild. We don't have time before winter, and even if we somehow managed it, what's to stop Garrett from just burning it down again?" "Then we make sure he can't," Clara was shouting now too, all the fear and exhaustion and rage of the past weeks pouring out. "We fight back, we press charges, we do whatever it takes to make sure he pays for this." "With what proof?" "We weren't here when it happened. We can't prove he did it, and even if we could, he owns half the town, including the sheriff." "Nothing will happen to him, Clara. Nothing ever happens to men like Thomas Garrett." The truth of it hung between them, bitter and undeniable. Men like Garrett didn't face consequences. They bought their way out of trouble, or intimidated witnesses, or simply waited until everyone got tired of fighting and gave up. The system was built to protect people like him, not people like Caleb and Clara, who had nothing but stubbornness and each other. "So what are you saying?" Clara asked quietly. "That we should just walk away? Let him have this place?" Caleb looked around at the ruins, his shoulders sagging. "I'm saying I don't know how to fight someone who's willing to burn everything down just to prove a point. I'm saying I'm tired, Clara. I'm so damn tired." Clara understood tired. She'd been tired for most of her life. Tired of struggling, tired of fighting just to survive, tired of a world that seemed determined to grind her down. But she'd learned something in the months since arriving in Belridge, something Caleb had taught her without even realizing it. "You told me once that you'd make sure you could keep your promise," she said. "That we'd make it through this. All of it." "That was before what? Before it got hard?" Clara moved closer, making him look at her. "Caleb, it's been hard from the beginning. Coming west was hard. Getting rejected by Garrett was hard. Working at that restaurant was hard. The storm was hard. The cattle drive was hard. Everything about this has been hard. But we did it anyway. We kept going because giving up wasn't an option." "This is different." "It's not different. It's just harder." Clara grabbed his hands, holding tight. "I came out here with nothing. $3 and a broken promise and no idea what I was going to do with my life. You gave me a chance when no one else would. You gave me a place, a purpose, something worth fighting for, and I'll be damned if I'm going to watch you throw that away because Thomas Garrett set a fire." Caleb's hands tightened on hers. "What if we can't do it? What if we try to rebuild and fail?" "Then we fail trying, which is better than failing because we gave up." Clara pressed her forehead against his. "But I don't think we're going to fail. I think we're going to rebuild this place, and it's going to be better than before. And Thomas Garrett is going to watch us do it and know that for all his money and all his spite, he couldn't destroy us." For a long moment, Caleb didn't speak. Then he pulled her close, burying his face in her hair, and Clara felt his shoulders shake. He was crying, she realized, quietly, like he was ashamed of it, like grief was something to be hidden. "I loved her," he said, his voice muffled. "Sarah. And when she died, I thought that was the end of everything that mattered. I kept this place running because I didn't know what else to do, But it wasn't living. It was just existing, waiting. Clara held him tighter, letting him talk. And then you showed up, stubborn and angry and refusing to quit even when any sane person would have. And suddenly I had a reason to care again. Not just about the ranch, but about... He pulled back to look at her, his eyes red but clear. About having a future. About building something that mattered, and now it's gone. And I'm scared, Clara. I'm scared that if we try and fail, I'll lose you too. I don't think I could survive that. You won't lose me, Clara said fiercely. I didn't come this far to walk away now. We're in this together, remember? Whatever happens, we face it together. Even if it means starting from nothing? We've both started from nothing before. At least this time we're doing it together. Caleb kissed her then, desperate and fierce, and Clara kissed him back with everything she had. They stood there in the ruins of the house, holding on to each other like lifelines, and Clara felt something settle in her chest. This was what love looked like in the real world. Not grand gestures or easy promises, but choosing to stay when things got hard, choosing to rebuild when everything fell apart, choosing each other over and over, even when it would be easier to walk away. When they finally pulled apart, Jack and Samuel were pretending very hard not to have noticed, busying themselves with sorting through salvage. Clara smiled despite everything. All right, Caleb said, his voice stronger now. We rebuild, but we do it smart. First priority is shelter before winter hits. We can live in a tent for now, build a small cabin, one room, just enough to get through the cold months. Spring, we start on something bigger. What about Garrett? Samuel asked. He's not going to just let this go. No, he's not. Caleb's expression hardened. Which is why we're going into town tomorrow. I'm paying off that loan in full, in front of witnesses, and I'm filing charges against Garrett for arson. Even if nothing comes of it legally, I want it on record. I want everyone in Belridge to know what he did. He'll deny it, Jack warned. Of course he will. But people aren't stupid. They'll know. Caleb looked at Clara. And sometimes making sure people know the truth is victory enough. They spent the rest of the day making camp and planning. The $600 from the cattle sale would have to stretch further than they'd hoped, covering not just the loan but materials for rebuilding, supplies to get through winter, everything they'd lost in the fire. It would be tight. They'd have to be smart, make every dollar count, accept help when it was offered. That night, lying in a borrowed tent under a sky full of stars, Clara listened to Caleb's breathing and thought about how far she'd come. 4 months ago, she'd been standing on a train platform being rejected by a man who thought she wasn't good enough. Now she was lying next to a man who saw her as an equal, a partner, someone worth fighting for and fighting beside. What are you thinking about? Caleb asked quietly. How strange life is. How you never know where you're going to end up. You regret coming west? Not for a second. Clara rolled over to face him. Even with everything that's happened, I wouldn't change it. This, you, the ranch, finding something worth fighting for, it's more than I ever thought I'd have. I love you, Caleb said, and the words came out simple and certain, like stating a fact. I know the timing's terrible, and we're sleeping in a tent, and everything's a mess, but I love you, and I needed you to know that. Clara felt tears prick her eyes, the good kind this time. I love you too. And the timing's perfect, actually. If you're going to say it when things are hard. That's when it means the most. Marry me. Clara blinked, sure she'd misheard. What? Marry me. Caleb propped himself up on one elbow. I know I don't have much to offer right now. No house, no barn, nothing but a pile of ashes and a dream of rebuilding. But I want to rebuild it with you, as my wife, as my partner in all of this. Clara's heart was hammering. You're serious. Completely serious. I've never been more serious about anything in my life. He took her hand. I'm not Thomas Garrett, Clara. I can't give you silk dresses or fancy parties or a life of ease. What I can give you is hard work and uncertain futures and the promise that whatever happens, we face it together. If that's enough, it's more than enough. Clara kissed him before he could say anything else. Yes, I'll marry you. Marry. They held each other in the darkness, and Clara thought about Sarah, the woman Caleb had loved and lost. She wasn't trying to replace her. Nobody could replace someone who'd been loved that deeply. But she could build something new alongside those memories, create a future that honored the past without being trapped by it. That was what survival looked like. Not forgetting, but learning to carry the weight and keep moving forward. The next morning, they rode into Belridge together. Jack and Samuel came too, partly as witnesses and partly because nobody was willing to let Caleb face Garrett alone. The town looked the same as always, dusty and worn, buildings that had seen better days, people going about their business with the dogged persistence of frontier life. The bank sat at the end of Main Street, imposing in its fresh paint and glass windows. Thomas Garrett's pride, the symbol of his success and respectability. Clara felt her stomach tighten as they approached, but she kept her chin up and her expression neutral. Inside, the bank was cool and quiet, smelling of ink and paper and money. Thomas Garrett sat behind a large desk, looking every bit the successful businessman in his pressed suit and polished shoes. When he saw them enter, his smile was sharp as a knife. "Mr. Rourke," he said pleasantly. "Miss Whitmore, what an unexpected pleasure. I heard about the unfortunate fire at your ranch. Such a tragedy." The false sympathy in his voice made Clara want to hit him. Caleb's jaw tightened, but his voice stayed level. "I'm here to pay off my mortgage. In full." Garrett's smile didn't waver. "I'm afraid that won't be possible. The property securing the loan has been significantly damaged. The bank can't accept payment on a loan backed by destroyed collateral." "The land is still there," Caleb said. "The loan is secured by the land, not the buildings on it. And I'm paying it off in full right now, so the collateral doesn't matter anymore." Nevertheless, nothing. Caleb pulled the money from his pocket, counted out $340 in bills and coin, and set it on the desk. "That's the full balance of my loan, paid in cash, in front of witnesses." He gestured to Jack, Samuel, and Clara. "You can write me a receipt or not, but the debt is settled." Garrett's expression finally cracked, anger showing through the veneer of civility. "You can't just—" "I can, and I am." Caleb leaned forward, his voice dropping. "And while we're here, I'm filing a formal complaint with the sheriff's office about the fire. Someone burned down my ranch, and I have a pretty good idea who." "Careful, Rourke. Accusations like that could be considered slander." "It's only slander if it's not true." Caleb straightened. "Everyone in this town knows what you are, Garrett. They might be too scared or too smart to say it out loud, but they know. You tried to ruin me through the bank, tried to sabotage my cattle sale, and when that didn't work, you burned everything I owned. But I'm still here, and I'm not going anywhere." For a moment, Garrett just stared at him, his face flushed with rage. Then he grabbed a receipt book and scribbled something, tearing off the paper and shoving it across the desk. "Your loan is paid," he said coldly. "Now, get out of my bank." "Gladly." Caleb picked up the receipt, folded it carefully, and put it in his pocket. "Oh, and one more thing. Claire and I are getting married. I wanted you to know that the woman you threw away is going to help me build something better than you could ever imagine. Sleep well with that knowledge." They walked out with their heads high, leaving Thomas Garrett sputtering behind his desk. Outside, Clara started laughing, the sound bubbling up uncontrollably. "Did you see his face?" she gasped. "When you told him we were getting married?" "I thought he might have a stroke," Jack said, grinning. "That was beautiful." The sheriff's office was next, where they filed a formal complaint about the fire. The sheriff, a heavy-set man who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else, took their statement with obvious reluctance. "I'll look into it," he said, in a tone that suggested he'd do nothing of the sort. "But without proof, there's not much I can do." "We know," Caleb said, "but it's on record now. That's what matters." Walking back to their horses, Clara felt lighter than she had in days. The ranch was still destroyed, they still faced a hard road ahead, but they'd stood up to Garrett and survived. They'd paid off the loan and made their stand. It was something. "When do you want to get married?" Caleb asked as they mounted up. "Soon as possible," Clara said. "Why wait?" Why wait indeed? Caleb's smile was genuine now, reaching his eyes. "Tomorrow?" "Tomorrow works." They were married the next afternoon in the church at Belridge, with Jack and Samuel as witnesses, and Mrs. Chen providing a hastily assembled meal afterward. It wasn't fancy. Clara wore her cleanest dress, which still had patches and mended seams, and Caleb wore his work clothes because they were all he had. But it was real, and it was theirs. And when Caleb slipped a simple silver band onto Clara's finger, bought with the last of his spare money, she felt like the wealthiest woman in the world. "I'm sorry I can't give you more," he whispered. "You gave me everything," Clara whispered back. "A home, a purpose, a future. What else could I possibly want?" The weeks that followed were the hardest of Clara's life. They lived in a tent while they worked on building a small cabin, one room with a stone fireplace and a roof that would hopefully keep out the winter snow. Every nail was precious, every board carefully measured and placed. Clara learned to work alongside Caleb, Jack, and Samuel, her hands blistering and healing and blistering again. But something unexpected happened as they worked. People started showing up. Neighbors Clara didn't even know existed. Ranchers from miles around who'd heard about the fire and came to help. Some brought lumber, others brought food or tools or just their labor. Mrs. Chen arrived one day with blankets and cooking supplies. Even Martin from the restaurant showed up with a wagon load of provisions and refused payment. "You stood up to Garrett," he said gruffly. "That's worth something out here." It turned out that Thomas Garrett wasn't as respected as he'd thought. People had been afraid of him, yes, but they hadn't liked him. And seeing someone finally push back, seeing Caleb and Clara refuse to be beaten, had inspired something in the community. A sense that maybe they didn't have to accept the Thomas Garretts of the world. Maybe they could build something different. The cabin was finished by the first snowfall, rough but solid, with a fireplace that drew properly and a roof that kept out the worst of the weather. It was tiny, one main room with a loft for sleeping, but it was warm, and it was theirs, and it was enough. Winter came hard that year, and there were days when Clara wondered if they'd made a terrible mistake. Days when the firewood ran low and the cold seemed to seep through every crack in the walls. Days when they ate thin soup and stale bread and tried not to think about everything they'd lost. But they survived. More than survived. They planned. Caleb drew sketches of what the new house would look like, where the barn would go, how they'd lay out the pastures come spring. Clara made lists of what they'd need, calculated costs, figured out how to stretch their remaining money through planting season. And at night, they held each other in the narrow bed in the loft and talked about the future they were going to build. Not the future Thomas Garrett had tried to destroy, but something new, something better. Spring came slowly, the snow melting to reveal scorched earth that Clara wasn't sure would ever grow anything again. But the land was tougher than it looked. Green shoots started appearing in the garden, grass began covering the burned areas, and life reasserted itself with stubborn persistence. They started building the new house in April, bigger than the old one, better planned, with a real kitchen and separate bedrooms and a porch that wrapped around two sides. It took months, working alongside Jack and Samuel and the neighbors who still showed up to help when they could spare the time. But by harvest time, the frame was up and the roof was on, and Clara could see what it would become. "It's going to be beautiful," she said one evening, standing with Caleb on what would be their front porch. "It's going to be home," Caleb corrected. "That's better than beautiful." The barn came next, then the outbuildings. Then slowly, piece by piece, the ranch took shape again. It didn't look like the old place. It looked better, stronger, built to last by people who'd learned from loss how to build something that mattered. In the fall, Clara found out she was pregnant. The news terrified and thrilled her in equal measure. A child, a future, something growing in the aftermath of destruction. "We're going to name him Caleb if it's a boy," Caleb said, his hand resting on her still flat stomach. "What if it's a girl?" "Then we'll name her Sarah." He said it simply, and Clara understood. Not replacing, just remembering, carrying forward the people and things they'd loved while building something new. "Sarah Whitmore Rourke," Clara said, testing the name. "I like it." Thomas Garrett's bank failed the following spring. Clara heard about it from Mrs. Chen, who heard it from someone who heard it from someone else. Apparently Garrett had been making bad investments, taking risks with depositors' money, and it had all caught up with him at once. He left town quietly, abandoning the bank and his fancy house, slinking away in the night like the coward he'd always been. Clara thought she'd feel satisfaction when she heard the news. Instead, she just felt tired. Garrett had been so determined to destroy them, so convinced of his own superiority, and in the end, he'd destroyed himself. There was no victory in that, just waste. "Do you ever think about what your life would have been like if he hadn't rejected you?" Caleb asked one night. Clara was sitting by the fire in their new house, mending one of Caleb's shirts while he worked on fixing a bridle. Their home was warm and lived in now, full of the small comforts they'd accumulated over 2 years of rebuilding. Sometimes, she admitted, but not often. That life would have been comfortable, maybe, but it wouldn't have been mine. I would have been Garrett's wife, living in his house, fitting into his idea of what I should be. Here, I'm just me, and that's worth more than comfort. Even with everything we went through, the fire, the struggle, all of it, especially because of all of it, Clara set down her mending. You know what I learned out here? That the hard things are what make us real. Not the easy times when everything goes smoothly, but the times when we have to choose who we're going to be. I chose to stay when I could have run. I chose to fight when I could have given up. And I chose you, over and over, even when it would have been easier not to. That's what I'm proud of. Caleb came to sit beside her, pulling her close. I chose you too. Best decision I ever made. Their daughter was born in the spring of 1880, in the bedroom of the new house with Mrs. Chen acting as midwife. Sarah came into the world screaming, red-faced, and perfect. And when Caleb held her for the first time, Clara saw tears streaming down his face. Hello, little one, he whispered. Welcome home. Home. That's what the ranch had become. Not just a place, but a feeling. The house they'd built together, board by board. The garden that Clara tended, coaxing vegetables out of stubborn soil. The barn where Caleb and the ranch hands worked the cattle. The land itself, marked by fire and struggle and the determination to endure. Standing on the porch one evening, baby Sarah sleeping in her arms and Caleb beside her, Clara looked out at everything they'd built and felt something settle deep in her chest. Peace, maybe. Or just the quiet satisfaction of knowing she'd found where she belonged. She'd come west with nothing but broken promises and desperate hope. She'd been rejected, humiliated, thrown away like she didn't matter. And from that low point, she'd built a life that was entirely her own. Not because it was given to her, but because she'd fought for it, earned it, claimed it with blistered hands and stubborn will and the refusal to accept defeat. What are you thinking? Caleb asked. Clara smiled. That I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be. The ranch prospered over the years that followed. Not easily. Nothing about frontier life was easy, but steadily. They added more cattle, hired additional hands, expanded the house as more children came. Jack eventually bought land nearby, and Samuel married a widow from town and started his own small ranch. The community they'd accidentally helped build grew stronger, more connected, people looking out for each other in the way that frontier communities had to in order to survive. And sometimes, standing on her porch and watching the sun set over the mountains, Clara thought about the girl she'd been when she first arrived in Belridge. Lost, desperate, convinced she'd made a terrible mistake. That girl had been right about the mistake. Coming west to marry Thomas Garrett had been foolish. But the journey itself had been the best thing that ever happened to her, because she'd learned something essential in the fire and the struggle and the rebuilding. She'd learned that you don't find your place in the world by looking for someone to give it to you. You find it by refusing to quit when everything falls apart, by standing back up when you get knocked down, by choosing, every single day, to be the person you want to be rather than the person circumstances try to make you. She'd learned that love isn't about grand gestures or perfect moments. It's about showing up when things are hard, about rebuilding together when everything burns down, about choosing each other over and over, even when it would be easier to walk away. She'd learned that home isn't a place you find. It's something you build piece by piece with the people who matter most. Years later, when Clara was old and her children had children of their own, they'd ask her to tell them the story of how she came west. She'd tell them about the train platform, about Thomas Garrett's rejection, about the fire that destroyed everything and the stubborn determination that rebuilt it. But most of all, she'd tell them about the choice to stay when everything said run, the choice to fight when surrender would have been easier, the choice to believe that even from ashes, something beautiful could grow. That's the secret, she'd tell them, her weathered hands holding theirs. Life is going to knock you down. It's going to burn everything you've built and leave you standing in the ruins wondering what comes next. And the choice you make in that moment, to give up or to rebuild, to run or to fight, to let yourself be defeated or to stand back up one more time, that choice is what makes you who you are. But what if you fail? They'd ask. And Clara would smile, remembering a night under the stars when Caleb had asked her the same question. "Then you fail trying," she'd say, "which is better than failing because you gave up. And who knows? You might not fail at all. You might just build something better than you ever imagined." Because that's what she and Caleb had done. From rejection and ruin, from loss and fire and struggle, they'd built not just a ranch, but a legacy, a life that mattered, a home that endured. And in the end, that was worth more than all the silk dresses and comfortable lives in the world.